Hello, guys. Tonight I want to tell you a story about invisible wounds, scars deeply etched in the souls of those who lived through war. The Vietnam War, for many, ended long ago on maps, but in the hearts of soldiers, it remains as vivid as yesterday. This story is about an American soldier named John Miller and his journey to find himself again after returning from a distant place ravaged by bombs and pain. Let's listen together, and perhaps we will find a little peace in these fragments of memory. Part 1. Ghosts of the Past. Chapter 1. Uneasy Dawn. The shrill alarm clock cut through the quiet night, but John Miller had been awake for a long time. The clock showed 4:30 a.m. The faint light from the window wasn't enough to dispel the thick darkness in his small room, nor in his mind. Once again, he had escaped the familiar nightmare, but its aftertaste still clung, cold and terrifyingly real. In his dream, he was there again, in the dense, humid jungle of Vietnam. The thumping of helicopters overhead, the sharp crackle of AK rifles, the desperate screams of comrades, and the acrid smell of gunpowder, of churned earth, and even of blood. He tried to run, tried to find shelter, but his legs felt heavy, as if bound by thick mud. Then a deafening explosion, a flash of light, and he saw Mike, his best friend, fall right before his eyes. Mike's eyes looked at him, filled with horror and pleading, before being swallowed by smoke, dust, and a terrifying silence. John jolted upright, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. His heart pounded in his chest as if it wanted to burst out. He raised a hand to his forehead, feeling the cold sweat. The room was still his familiar room in the quiet suburbs, not that deadly jungle, but the feeling of fear, guilt, and helplessness remained intact, as if he had just relived it all. He sat there on the edge of the bed in the dark, trying to regulate his breathing. More than 20 years had passed since he returned from Vietnam, but those ghosts had never left him. They hid in every corner of his mind, waiting for a moment of weakness to flood back, tormenting him with the sights, sounds, and smells of war. John was a man in his late 40s or early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a few deep wrinkles around his eyes. His body was lean, no longer as robust as in his youth, but he still retained the toughness of someone who had endured hardship. His eyes often held sadness and a faraway look, as if his soul was still trapped somewhere distant. He liked quiet, hated sudden loud noises. Car horns, fireworks, or even overly loud children's screams were enough to make him jump. His heart pound and feel uncomfortable. He got out of bed, his bare feet on the cold wooden floor. John went into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood leaning against the windowsill, looking out at his small garden. The garden was still in darkness, with only faint rays of dawn light trying to filter through the leaves. John loved gardening. It was a meticulous, patient task, and most importantly, it brought peace. His tomato plants, lettuce, and other vegetables grew daily under his care, giving him a sense of control, something he had lost a long time ago. John's current life was quite solitary. He worked as a freelance carpenter, taking small jobs like repairing furniture, building tables and chairs on demand. This work suited his personality, minimal interaction, requiring focus and meticulousness. He had a small house in the suburbs, large enough for one person, with a small woodworking shop in the back. He had one grown son, David. David lived in another city, visiting him occasionally. The relationship between father and son was quite distant. John loved his son, but he didn't know how to express it. The invisible wounds had created an invisible wall between him and the outside world, even his closest loved ones. David felt the same way. He wanted to be close to his father, but didn't know how to break through his silence and reclusiveness. He had tried many times, but whenever he brought up the past or tried to ask about the war, John would become tense, change the subject, or simply walk away. John's isolation wasn't something he wanted, but it was a consequence of what he had endured. He feared intimacy, feared facing questions he couldn't answer, and feared confronting emotions he couldn't control. Whenever a memory suddenly flooded back, it pulled him back to that living hell, and he didn't want anyone to witness those moments of weakness. Dawn gradually broke, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the leaves, casting streaks of light on the damp earth. John still stood there, motionless, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He knew a new day had begun, and he would again have to face the ghosts of the past, the wounds that never healed. Chapter 2. The Sealed Box. After a simple breakfast of toast and black coffee, John stepped into his woodworking shop. The faint scent of pine and oak wood in the air brought him a pleasant feeling. The sound of planing wood, the whir of the saw, were familiar sounds that helped him focus and temporarily dispel haunting thoughts. Today, he was finishing a small bookshelf for a regular client. As he was tidying his tools, John's hand accidentally brushed against an old wooden box, tucked away in a corner of the cabinet. The box was made of dark wood, faded over time with scratches and dents. It had no lock, but John always kept it in a secluded spot, as if to hide the secrets within. This was his sealed box, containing mementos from the Vietnam War. John rarely opened this box. Each time he touched it, a cold current ran down his spine, bringing with it fragmented images of the past. But today, perhaps due to the lingering effects of the early morning nightmare, he felt a strange urge. He took the box out, placed it on his workbench, and brushed off the thin layer of dust on its surface. He took a deep breath, then slowly opened the lid. Inside, everything lay intact, neatly arranged but faded by time. First was an old yellowed stack of letters. These were letters from his mother and sister, sent to the battlefield. John picked up a letter. His mother's handwriting was still clear, though somewhat faded. He didn't read them, just caressed the lines of script, feeling the warmth of family from a distant past. These letters were once his only link to the peaceful life back home, a source of motivation to endure the brutal days. Beneath the letters was a rusted Zippo lighter, engraved with the name Mike, and a small inscription, "Always with you." This was Mike's lighter, John's best friend, who had fallen in that fateful battle. The lighter was the only thing left of Mike, and it was always a painful reminder of loss. John traced his finger over the engraved words, feeling a sharp pang in his chest. He remembered Mike's smile, his jokes, and Mike's horrified eyes in his last moments. Next was a faded military badge, a small medallion that had lost its shine. It was a symbol of what he had endured, what he had done, but also a symbol of what he had lost. John never wore it. It was simply a piece of evidence, a reminder of a part of his life he wanted to bury. Finally, at the bottom of the box was a faded photograph. It showed John and Mike with a few other comrades, all very young, standing together, smiling brightly in their uniforms. They were in what appeared to be a military camp, with palm trees and a clear blue sky in the background. Their smiles were carefree, innocent, unaware of what awaited them. John stared at the photo, his gaze resting on Mike's smiling face. A wave of guilt washed over him. Why had Mike died, and he hadn't? That question had haunted him for so many years. As John was lost in his memories, a knock on the door sounded. He startled, quickly closing the box and hiding it back in its spot. The knock brought him back to reality. "Hello, John. Are you home?" It was Martha, John's neighbor. She was a woman in her 60s, cheerful, active, and always caring about those around her. She was one of the few people John felt comfortable interacting with. John opened the workshop door. Martha stood there, holding a plate of freshly baked, still warm apple pie. "I just made a new batch of apple pie. Brought you some." "Thank you, Martha," John said, his voice a little hoarse. He tried to force a smile. Martha looked at him searchingly. "Couldn't sleep again, John? You look tired." John just shook his head. "It's nothing, just a bit hard to sleep." Martha didn't ask further. She knew John didn't like to talk about his personal issues, especially those related to his sleep. She had lived next to John for years, and she understood that he was a kind man, but carried a deep sadness within him. Sometimes she heard John yell in the night, and she knew those were war nightmares. She wanted to help him, but didn't know where to start. "All right then, you rest up. The pie's still warm. Eat it while it's fresh," Martha said, placing the plate on the table and turning to leave. John watched Martha's retreating back. He knew she cared about him, and he appreciated it. But he couldn't open up. The invisible wounds had eaten deep into his soul, making him withdrawn and afraid of intimacy. He turned back to the unfinished bookshelf he was working on, but his mind still lingered on that wooden box. Images of Mike, of the jungle, of gunshots still vivid in his head. He knew that to find peace, he would have to face those ghosts, but he didn't know if he had the courage to do it. Part 2. Echoes from the Green Jungle, Chapter 3, the first mission. The ship's horn shrieked, piercing the still night at San Francisco Harbor. John Miller, then just 22, stood on the transport ship's deck, gripping the railing, watching the coastline slowly recede. The city's lights twinkled, but in his eyes it was just a faint glow, about to be swallowed by the ocean's darkness and an uncertain future. Ahead of him was Vietnam, a name he had only known through news reports and patriotic calls. Now, it was his destination, and that of thousands of other young Americans, trained to be infantrymen, carrying ideals of a righteous war. John was a tall, lean young man with short brown hair and wide, innocent blue eyes. He grew up in a small Midwestern town, his life simple and quiet. The decision to enlist came naturally to him as a civic duty. He believed what he was taught: protect freedom, fight communism. He never thought his life would be changed forever by a war in such a distant place. The sea journey lasted for weeks, long enough for John and the other recruits to get to know each other. They came from all corners of the country with different stories and dreams. Among them, John became particularly close to Mike O'Connell, a cheerful, optimistic guy from New York. Mike had sandy blonde hair, a bright smile, and always knew how to crack a joke to ease the tension. He had a girlfriend waiting for him back home, and he always showed off her photos to John. "Hey, John, what do you think we'll be doing over there?" Mike asked, as they stood together on the deck, looking out at the vast ocean. John shrugged. "I don't know, Mike. Probably just doing our duty like they taught us." "I hope it's not too bad," Mike said, but his voice betrayed a hint of worry. "I just want to get my tour done and go home to Mary Jane." John nodded. He felt the same. He also wanted to go home, back to his mother and sister, to the peaceful life he had left behind. When the ship docked at Vung Tau, the humid heat of Vietnam hit them like a punch. The air was thick with the smell of earth, the salt of the sea, and a strange fragrance John had never smelled before, the scent of tropical plants, of life, and also of decay. The first sight that met their eyes was dusty roads, dilapidated houses, and the unfamiliar faces of Vietnamese people, their eyes both curious and wary. They were transferred to a temporary military base where they underwent their final days of training. The continuous sound of gunfire on the firing range, the shouts of drill sergeants, and the harshness of the environment gradually transformed the young men into real soldiers. "Listen up, new recruits!" Sergeant Miller, a burly man with a scarred face and sharp eyes, bellowed. "You're not home anymore. This is Vietnam. There are no rules here, no fairness. You have only one mission: survive and complete your duty. Understood?" "Understood, Sergeant," the group replied in unison. Sergeant Miller was a tough but fair leader. He had many years of experience in the field, and he knew how to keep his men alive. He taught them how to move through the jungle, how to spot booby traps, how to react quickly in dangerous situations. John and Mike were in the same squad, enduring harsh drills together, sharing quick meals and idle chatter to relieve stress. After a few weeks of training, John's squad was deployed to a small outpost in a rugged, mountainous jungle area. It was a frequent combat zone where American and Viet Cong forces constantly clashed. John's first mission was a routine patrol. He went with Mike, Lee, a more timid young soldier than John, and a few other soldiers under the command of Sergeant Miller. They moved slowly through the dense jungle, each step cautious, wary of every sound, every movement. The scorching heat and high humidity made sweat pour like rain. Thick bushes, towering ancient trees, and tangled vines created a green labyrinth, obscuring visibility and making them easy to get lost. John felt a cold fear crawl down his spine. He had never been anywhere like this. The chirping of insects, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the pounding of his own heart in his chest, everything became terrifying. He kept his M16 rifle ready, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "You okay, John?" Mike whispered as they stopped for a brief rest. John nodded, trying to hide his anxiety. "Just a bit strange." Mike patted his shoulder. "Relax. We'll be fine." They continued to move. As they crossed a small stream, Sergeant Miller signaled them to stop. He gestured for John and Mike to scout ahead. John and Mike carefully advanced, each step light, trying not to make a sound. Suddenly, a loud explosion rang out. Boom! John flinched. The explosion wasn't from a gun, but a landmine. He spun around. Smoke and dust billowed from behind. "Ambush!" Sergeant Miller yelled. "Find cover!" Gunfire erupted throughout the jungle. Bullets whizzed past John's head. He hit the ground, trying to find cover. He saw Mike also trying to find cover nearby. John had never experienced real combat. The chaos, the gunshots, the screams, and the acrid smell of gunpowder left him disoriented. He saw an American soldier fall, blood spreading on the ground. He heard Lee's faint moans. "John, over here!" Mike yelled, pulling him behind a large tree. John trembled, trying to hold his rifle steady. He fired back instinctively, aiming at shadowy figures darting through the bushes. He didn't know if he hit anyone or if he hit anyone at all. He just knew he had to shoot, had to survive. The firefight was fierce. The gunfire was relentless. John felt time pass so slowly. Every second, a struggle for survival. He saw Sergeant Miller calmly commanding, ordering his men to return fire and provide cover for each other. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the gunfire gradually subsided, then ceased altogether. The air became eerily silent. Only the heavy breathing of the soldiers remained and the faint moans of the wounded. Sergeant Miller signaled them to assess the situation. John and Mike cautiously crawled out of cover. The sight before John chilled him to the bone. Several American soldiers had fallen, lying motionless on the ground. Blood stained the leaves and mud. Lee was wounded in the leg, being bandaged by a medic. John looked at Mike. Mike was looking at him too, his face pale, his eyes filled with horror. We survived," Mike whispered. John nodded, but there was no joy in his heart. He only felt an emptiness, a profound fear. He had witnessed death, experienced the chaos of war. His life, y'all, from this moment on, would never be the same. The first mission had ended, but it had left the first scar on John's soul. Chapter 4. Days in the War Zone. After the first ambush, John and his comrades continued their lives as infantrymen in Vietnam. Every day was a new struggle, not only against the enemy, but also against the harsh environment and constant fear. Their outpost was a collection of canvas tents and makeshift fortifications surrounded by barbed wire and minefields. Life there was deprived of many things: clean water, fresh food, and even true moments of rest. Long patrols became an indispensable part of John's life. They moved through dense, humid jungles where every step could conceal a deadly danger. The scorching heat and high humidity made clothes constantly cling to their bodies. Leeches, mosquitoes, and all kinds of insects relentlessly clung to them. The smell of mud, decaying leaves, and sweat blended to form a characteristic scent of the battlefield. John learned to doze off sitting up, learned to eat dry rations without complaining, and learned to live with fear. He always kept his M16 rifle within reach, even when sleeping. The distant sound of gunfire, the thumping of helicopters overhead, and the incessant chirping of insects at night became familiar sounds. Nightmares began to appear even during the war. John frequently dreamed of the terrifying scenes from the first ambush or the faces of fallen soldiers. He would jolt awake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, and it would take him a while to realize where he was. Despite the harsh life, the camaraderie between John and Mike, along with the other soldiers in the squad, grew stronger. They were the only ones who truly understood what the others were going through. They shared hurried meals, cigarettes, and idle chatter to relieve tension. Mike remained the most optimistic, always trying to crack jokes to keep the spirits up. He often told John about his girlfriend Mary Jane, about their plans after he returned home. "When I get back, I'm going to marry Mary Jane, buy a little house in the suburbs, and get a pack of dogs," Mike said, his eyes dreamily looking up at the starry sky. "What about you, John? Got any plans?" John shrugged. I haven't thought about it. Just want to go home." "Going home is good," Mike smiled, "but you got to have something to look forward to. A girl, a job, a peaceful life." John nodded, but inside he still felt an emptiness. He didn't know if he could return to normal life after all he had witnessed. One day, while patrolling deep in the jungle, John's squad discovered a secret Viet Cong bunker. Sergeant Miller ordered them to surround and attack. The firefight was swift and fierce. John and Mike provided cover for each other, returning fire. In the chaos, a new soldier in the squad named Billy was hit. He fell, blood spreading on the ground. "Billy!" Mike yelled, trying to run to him. "Don't, medic!" Sergeant Miller ordered. John looked at Billy, his face pale, his eyes filled with pain. He was so young, perhaps only 18 or 19. John felt a surge of helplessness inside him. He had witnessed too many deaths. Each time, part of him died too. A medic quickly arrived, trying to stop the bleeding for Billy, but the wound was too severe. Billy looked at John, his eyes weak but pleading. "John, I don't want to die." John squeezed Billy's hand, trying to offer words of comfort, but his throat tightened. He couldn't say anything. He could only watch Billy take his last breath, his eyes slowly becoming lifeless. Billy's death was a huge shock to John. It wasn't the first death he had witnessed, but it left a deeper scar. Billy was a young, innocent soldier who never had a chance to live a full life. John felt a surge of anger inside him, anger at the war, anger at cruel fate. After Billy's death, John became more withdrawn. He spoke less, and his eyes often gazed into the distance. Mike tried to comfort him, but John remained silent. He knew Mike was also hurting, but he couldn't share his own pain. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of chaotic emotions, fear, anger, guilt, and helplessness. The days in Vietnam dragged on, endless and full of danger. John and his comrades continued to carry out patrols, ambushes, and engagements. Each battle left new scars, both physical and mental. They lived in a state of high alert, never knowing when danger would strike. One night, while on watch, John looked up at the starry sky. He remembered home, peaceful summer nights, the chirping of crickets, and the smell of dry grass. He remembered his mother, his sister, warm family meals. A tear rolled down his cheek. He wondered, would he ever return to that life again? Could he ever be the John he once was? He knew the war was changing him. It was stealing his innocence, stealing his faith, and stealing a part of his soul. He was slowly becoming someone else, a hardened soldier carrying invisible wounds that no one could see. Chapter 5. The Fateful Turning Point. In March 1969, John's squad was assigned a special mission to scout and destroy a vital Viet Cong logistics base deep within the dense jungle of the A Shau Valley. This was a notoriously dangerous area where American forces had suffered heavy losses. The mission was assessed as extremely hazardous, and Sergeant Miller had warned the entire team about the risks. "Listen up, boys," Sergeant Miller said, his face more tense than ever. "This isn't a routine patrol. We're going deep into enemy territory. There will be fierce fighting. I can't promise that all of us will come back, but I promise that we'll fight our hardest." John felt a cold chill run down his spine. He looked at Mike, who was also looking at him, both their eyes filled with worry. They knew this could be their last mission. The squad moved silently through the jungle. The first few days passed relatively peacefully, with only minor skirmishes. They pushed deeper into unexplored territory, where the trees were so dense that sunlight barely pierced through. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and lurking danger. By the fourth day, as they were moving up a gentle slope, gunfire suddenly erupted from all directions. "Ambush!" Sergeant Miller yelled. The crackle of AK rifles, the roar of machine guns, and the explosion of grenades echoed throughout the jungle. John and his comrades immediately hit the ground, seeking cover. John fired back wildly, trying to hold his position. He saw Mike also fighting fiercely, his face covered in mud and sweat. The firefight was more intense than any battle John had ever experienced. They were surrounded from all sides. The screams and groans of the wounded reverberated everywhere. John saw several of his comrades fall. "We're outnumbered," a soldier yelled. Sergeant Miller tried to maintain formation, but the situation was worsening. Bullets rained down, tearing through tree leaves and churning up the ground. In the chaos, John heard Mike yell, "John, I'm hit!" John spun around. Mike lay on the ground, clutching his stomach. Blood soaked his uniform. Mike's eyes looked at John, filled with horror and pleading. "Mike!" John crawled to Mike, trying to bandage his wound. "Hang on, Mike! Medic's coming!" No time, John," Mike gasped, his breath growing weaker. You gotta go. Survive. Go home, The gunfire still blared. Sergeant Miller yelled, Fall back! Fall back! We can't hold this position!" John looked at Mike, then at Sergeant Miller. He knew if he stayed with Mike, they would both die. But he couldn't abandon his friend. "John, go," Mike whispered, his eyes starting to glaze over. "Save Mary Jane." John felt a heartbreaking pain. He clutched Mike's hand tightly, feeling the last warmth of his closest friend. He wanted to stay, wanted to fight to the end, but he knew he couldn't. He had to survive. He had to carry Mike's promise. With a broken heart, John let go of Mike's hand. He turned away, crawling after Sergeant Miller and the remaining soldiers. Gunfire still echoed behind him, but John didn't look back. He knew Mike was gone. They retreated in chaos, running through the dense jungle, dodging whizzing bullets. John didn't know how far he had run, only that he kept running until the gunfire faded behind him. When they stopped in a relatively safe place, John collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. His face was covered in mud and tears. He had survived, but he had lost his best friend. Mike's death and the fact that he had to leave his friend behind became the deepest invisible wound in John's soul. The guilt, helplessness, and profound fear had eaten deep into him, haunting him forever after. The mission failed. They had not destroyed the enemy base, and they had suffered heavy losses. But for John, the most important thing was not the mission's failure, but the loss of Mike. He carried the image of Mike falling, his pleading eyes, and his last whisper about Mary Jane. From that moment on, John became more hardened. He no longer laughed or talked much. He just performed his duties mechanically like a shadow. He had witnessed too much death, experienced too much pain. His heart seemed to have frozen. When the squad returned to the outpost, a heavy atmosphere hung over them. The surviving soldiers all bore wounds, both physical and mental. John sat alone in a corner, his eyes vacant, staring into the distance. He knew a part of him had died in that jungle, along with Mike, and the rest of him, though still alive, was severely wounded. Part 3, The Way Home. Chapter 6, The Cold Return. After nearly 2 years of service in Vietnam, John Miller finally received his discharge orders. The day he left the battlefield, there was no celebratory welcome, no trumpets, no cheers. Only a long flight, taking him back to a country that felt foreign, a life he didn't know if he could reintegrate into. When the plane landed at the military base in California, John stepped off with an empty feeling. He watched the other soldiers, who were cheering joyfully at being home, but in his heart there was no emotion. He felt like an outsider, a lost shadow in the crowd. Society's attitude towards Vietnam veterans at the time was far from welcoming. The Vietnam War was controversial, and many Americans did not support it. When soldiers returned, they were not seen as heroes, but sometimes even as criminals or failures. John witnessed anti-war protests, derogatory remarks aimed at soldiers that only made him feel more isolated and hurt. He returned to his small hometown where his mother and sister were waiting. His mother hugged him tightly, tears welling in her eyes. His sister, Sarah, was also overjoyed. They had waited for him to return for so many years. "My son is home," his mother said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so glad, my dear." John tried to force a smile, but he found it difficult. He couldn't share their joy. He had experienced too much, witnessed too many horrors, to the point where he no longer knew how to feel joy fully. Life at home was completely different from the battlefield. There were no gunshots, no explosions, no lurking danger, but John found it hard to adapt. And he couldn't sleep well. Nightmares continued to torment him every night. Sudden loud noises, even just the sound of a truck passing by, were enough to make him jump, his heart pounding. He became withdrawn, spoke little. His mother and sister tried to ask questions, tried to understand what he had been through. "How was Vietnam, John?" Sarah asked, her eyes curious. John just shook his head. "Nothing to say, Sarah." "Did you fight bravely?" his mother asked. "I just did what I had to do," John replied curtly. He couldn't share what he had experienced. How could he tell them about Mike's death, about the horrors he had witnessed, about the profound fear that had eaten into his soul? They wouldn't understand. They would be afraid. And he didn't want them to bear his pain. John found a simple job at a local woodworking shop. This job suited him. Little interaction, requiring focus and meticulousness. He worked hard, but his mind often lingered somewhere far away. He tried to date, tried to build social relationships, but everything fell apart. The women he met couldn't understand his detachment, his difficulty expressing emotions. He constantly felt like an outsider, not belonging in this world. The symptoms of PTSD became increasingly apparent. John frequently suffered from depression and anxiety. He was easily irritable, prone to uncontrolled emotional outbursts, then quickly regretted and blamed himself. He started drinking to try and soothe his inner pain, but alcohol only made things worse. Once, while sitting alone drinking at a bar, a stranger approached him. "Are you a Vietnam vet?" the man asked, his tone filled with contempt. "You guys are killers. You committed atrocities over there." John felt a surge of anger. He stood up, clenching his fists, wanting to punch the man, but he restrained himself. He simply walked away silently, leaving the man with his derogatory remarks. He felt like a burden to his family. His mother worried about him. His sister tried to help him, but he couldn't accept their help. He isolated himself, living in his own world where the ghosts of the past continued to torment him. John knew he needed to find a way to heal those invisible wounds, but he didn't know where to start. He felt trapped, unable to escape. The path home turned out to be much harder than the path to the battlefield. He had returned, but he hadn't truly come home yet. Chapter 7. A Fragmented Life. The years after returning from Vietnam were a long and continuous struggle of solitude for John Miller. He tried to live a normal life, but the invisible wounds from the battlefield clung to him relentlessly, like a haunting ghost. His carpentry job at the local workshop provided him with a stable income, but it couldn't fill the void in his soul. He worked mechanically, without joy or interest. His colleagues were kind people, but they couldn't understand his detachment. He rarely participated in their idle chatter and always kept a certain distance. His relationship with his mother and sister became increasingly difficult. His mother, with boundless love, tried to care for him, cooked his favorite dishes, and always asked about his life. But each time she asked, John felt a heavy pressure. He didn't want to lie, but he couldn't tell the truth either. How could he explain to his mother about the nightmares, the horrifying images, the constant fear? Sarah, his sister, had grown up and started her own family. She had her own life, happy and busy. She tried to draw him out of his shell, inviting him to her home, to family gatherings. But John frequently declined. He felt he didn't belong in crowded, noisy places. The laughter of children, loud music, or even the clatter of dishes were enough to make him uncomfortable and want to flee. The nightmares continued to torment John every night. They became increasingly vivid and realistic, waking him in fear and drenched in sweat. He frequently suffered from insomnia, which severely affected his health and mental state. He became irritable, quick-tempered, and constantly felt tired. To try and soothe his inner pain, John started drinking. At first, it was just a few drinks after work, but gradually it became a daily habit. Alcohol helped him temporarily forget the haunting memories, helped him sleep for a few hours. But when he woke up, the pain became even more intense. He knew he was destroying himself, but he couldn't stop. He once had a serious relationship with a woman named Emily. Emily was kind, gentle, and very patient. She loved John, and she tried to understand him. But John's invisible wounds created too great a barrier between them. John couldn't open up, couldn't share his emotions. He was often distant, cold, and sometimes even erupted in anger for no reason. One night, after a terrifying nightmare, John woke up in a state of panic. He couldn't control his emotions. He started screaming, smashing things. Emily, who was sleeping next to him, was frightened. She tried to comfort him, but he couldn't hear anything. He only saw images of war, gunshots, screams, and Mike's face. The next morning, when John regained his composure, he saw Emily sitting on the sofa, her face full of exhaustion and disappointment. "John," she said, her voice trembling, "I can't take this anymore. I can't live with a man I can't understand, a man who always lives in the past." John felt a sharp pain in his chest. He knew Emily was right. He had hurt her. He couldn't give her a normal life. "I'm sorry, Emily," John said, his voice hoarse. I can't control it." "I know," Emily said, tears streaming down her face. "But I can't continue like this. I need a peaceful life, John, I need a man who can be there for me, not a ghost." Their relationship ended soon after. John felt a great emptiness inside him. He knew he had lost a good woman, someone who had tried to love him, but he couldn't do anything else. He felt cursed, unable to find happiness. After Emily left, John became even more isolated. He quit his job at the woodworking shop and opened a small one at home. He only took small jobs, enough to make ends meet. He avoided people, living reclusively in his house. He knew his life was falling apart. The invisible wounds had transformed him into someone else, a man always living in the shadows of the past. He didn't know if he could ever find the light again. Part 4, Rebirth. Chapter 8. A faint glimmer of light. Many years passed, and John Miller continued to live in his solitary shell. His life passed by steadily, unremarkable. He worked in his woodworking shop, tended his small garden, and grappled with nightmares every night. He had accepted that this was his life, a life haunted by the past. However, John's life wasn't entirely covered in darkness. David, his son, though living far away and having his own life, never gave up trying to connect with his father. David had grown into a mature and understanding man. He knew what his father was enduring, even though John never spoke of it. David had read many books about PTSD and veterans, joined support groups for veterans' families, and was determined to find a way to help his father. One day, David came to visit John. This time, he didn't ask about the war, didn't try to force his father to share. Instead, he brought an old book, a novel about a soldier returning from World War II. "Dad," David said, placing the book on the table, "I think you'll like this one. It's about a soldier like you." John glanced at the book, then turned away. "I don't have time for reading, David." "Just give it a try, Dad," David persisted gently. "Maybe you'll find something in it." David stayed with John for a few days. He helped John in the garden, fixed a few things around the house. He didn't say much, simply being there for his father. David's patience and silent love began to soften John's hardened heart. One evening, when John couldn't sleep, he picked up the book David had given him. He read page by page, line by line, and gradually he saw himself in the story. The fear, the loneliness, the nightmares, all were described with terrifying realism. John realized he wasn't alone. Many others were enduring similar things. The book opened a faint glimmer of light in John's soul. He began to search for information about veteran support groups. He knew there were places where soldiers like him could share their stories without judgment. David, noticing the small change in his father, found a veteran support group in a nearby town. He offered to take John there. "I don't think I need it, David," John said, his voice still hesitant. I don't want to talk to anyone." "Just try it," David said softly. "You don't have to say anything. Just listen." John reluctantly agreed. That evening, David drove John to a small community center. A group of about 10 veterans sat in a cozy room. They were all middle-aged men with scars on their faces and in their eyes. John sat down in a corner trying to blend in. He didn't say a word. He just listened. A man named Frank, a former Marine, was talking about his nightmares, about the guilt of leaving comrades behind. Another, named Robert, recounted how he struggled with alcoholism after returning from the war. John listened to each story, and he felt a deep sense of empathy. What they said, what they felt, was exactly what he had experienced. He no longer felt alone. He saw tears rolling down the cheeks of some of the men in the group, and he knew they were tears of understanding, of release. When the meeting ended, John still hadn't said a word, but when David asked if he wanted to come back next week, John nodded. It was a small step, but it was a crucial step on John's healing journey. The faint light had appeared, and it was slowly growing stronger. Chapter 9. Opening the Sealed Box. After several weeks of attending the support group, John Miller maintained his silence. He listened, nodded, but never told his own story. The group members understood. They knew each person had their own pace for healing, and they didn't pressure John. They simply were there, listening and sharing. One evening, As John was sitting in his woodworking shop, preparing for bed, his gaze accidentally fell upon the old wooden box. The box he had hidden for so many years. The box containing his most painful memories. He hadn't opened it since the day Martha brought the pie. But today something was different. Perhaps it was the relief of knowing he wasn't alone, or perhaps it was a deeper urge from within his soul. John took the box out, placed it on the table. He took a deep breath, then slowly opened the lid. The old mementos still lay there. The yellowed stack of letters, the rusted Zippo lighter, the military badge, and the faded photo of him and Mike. He picked up the photo. Mike's smiling face was vivid in his mind. And then the memory of the fateful battle in the Etched Valley flooded back, as vivid as yesterday. The gunfire, the screams, the smell of gunpowder, and Mike's pleading eyes. John felt a heartbreaking pain. Tears began to stream down his cheeks. He had tried to suppress this emotion for so many years, but now it burst forth like a broken dam. He cried for Mike, cried for himself, cried for what was lost. The next morning, when he arrived at the support group meeting, John walked in with a different demeanor. His eyes were still a little swollen, but there was a strange determination in them. When his turn came, John took a deep breath. I'm John, he began, his voice slightly trembling. I'm a Vietnam veteran. The group listened in silence. I was there in 1968, 1969, John continued, his voice gradually steadying. I was infantry. I saw many terrible things. I lost my best friend there. He paused for a moment, trying to control his emotions. His name was Mike O'Connell. He was a good man. Always optimistic. He had a girlfriend waiting for him back home. John recounted the ambush in the Etched Valley, how Mike was hit, his pleading eyes, and Mike's last whisper about Mary Jane. He told of having to leave Mike to survive, of the guilt that had haunted him for so many years. I thought I was a coward, John said, tears again streaming down his face. I abandoned my friend. I survived, and he didn't. I don't deserve to live. The group remained silent. No one judged. No one interrupted. They just listened with understanding and empathy in their eyes. When John finished his story, Frank, the former Marine, walked over and patted his shoulder. John, Frank said, his voice warm, you're not a coward. You survived. You did what you had to do to survive. Mike wouldn't want you to die. He'd want you to live and to live well. Robert, who had struggled with alcoholism, also came closer. We understand, John. We've all been through similar things. That guilt, it clings to us. But you're not alone. John looked at the men around him. They were all people who had once carried invisible wounds, just like him. They understood him, and they accepted him. A wave of relief washed over John as if a huge burden had been lifted. It was the first time John had truly opened up, truly shared his story, and that was the moment his healing journey began. The sealed box had been opened, and the painful memories had been released. Chapter 10. Dawn Returns. After the fateful sharing at the support group, John Miller began a new phase in his life. The release of the guilt and pain that had weighed him down for so many years felt like a miracle. He still had nightmares, but they were no longer as vivid or frequent. He still startled at loud noises, but he had learned to control his reactions. John continued to attend the support group regularly. He not only listened, but also began to share more, not just about the pain, but also about the beautiful moments of camaraderie, about the lessons he had learned from the war. He found comfort and strength from his new friends, people who had walked through hell with him. They shared stories, memories, and together sought peace. David, John's son, noticed a distinct change in his father. John was no longer as withdrawn as before. He started calling David proactively, asking about his son's life. When David visited, John no longer avoided deep conversations. He even opened his keepsake box and told David about Mike, about his other comrades, and about the battles. "You know, David," John said, his eyes distant, but now with nostalgia instead of sadness, "Mike was a great friend. He always knew how to make everyone laugh, even in the worst situations." David listened to his father with attention and understanding. He felt a deeper connection with his father than ever before. The invisible wall between them had slowly crumbled. John also began to mend his relationships with his mother and sister. He visited his mother more often, gardened with her, and shared stories about his current life. He also visited Sarah and played with his grandchildren. The laughter of children no longer bothered him. Instead, it brought him a sense of warmth and peace. One day, John decided to make a special trip. He visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. He stood before the black stone wall engraved with the names of thousands of fallen soldiers searching for Mike O'Connell's name. When he found it, John reached out and touched it, feeling the coldness of the stone and the warmth of the tears rolling down his cheeks. "Mike," John whispered, his voice choked, "I came back. I survived. And I will live a full life for you, for Mary Jane, and for all those who fell." He no longer felt guilt. Instead, he felt a deep gratitude. He knew he had survived for a reason, and he would cherish this life. John was no longer a man haunted by the past. He still carried scars, both physical and mental, but he had learned to accept them. They were a part of who he was, proof of what he had endured, and a reminder of the preciousness of life. He continued his carpentry work, but now he worked with a new joy. He spent more time in his garden, and his tomato plants and lettuce grew better than ever. He also started volunteering at a local veteran center, sharing his experiences and helping other soldiers struggling with PTSD. John Miller's life wasn't a perfect, happy ending where all pain vanished, but it was a more realistic one, a journey of finding peace and meaning. He had found acceptance, understanding, and love from family and friends. He had returned, not just physically, but spiritually. Dawn had returned to John's life, bringing with it the light of hope and healing. Narrator's concluding remarks, and that is the story of John Miller. A story of invisible wounds, of a journey to find healing, and of rediscovering oneself after the war. John's life is a testament to the fact that while scars may never disappear, we can always find the strength to face them, to learn to live with them, and to find peace in life. I hope this story has given you some thoughts, some feelings. Always remember that our soldiers in any war have sacrificed so much. And listening to their stories, understanding what they have been through, is the best way for us to remember and honor them.